So unless you've been hiding under a rock, you've probably noticed that there's been a significant increase in sightings of unusual phenomena lately, encounters with strange lights, crafts, and beings. And revelations by whistleblowers like David Grush and others have exposed military crash retrieval and back engineering programs, bringing the alien issue fully into the mainstream, even if some people still can't believe it, and leading to increased calls for some form of official government disclosure.
As I've stated publicly already in my News Nation interview, Biologics came with some of these recoveries. Yeah.
Were they, I guess, human or non-human biologics?
Non-human, and that was the assessment of people with direct knowledge on the program I talked to that are currently still on the program.
Meanwhile, speculation about who these beings are and exactly what they are doing here runs wild, with some prominent voices in the movement arguing that all alien beings are benevolent. We're the assholes, and that open contact will represent a quantum leap for humanity, providing us with technology to solve our most pressing problems and catapulting us to a Type 1 civilization. Wouldn't that be nice? Others advise caution. After all, it's a vast universe out there, and it would be foolish to assume that everything in it has our best interests at heart. That's just not how nature works. It's not how any of this works. We don't know what we don't know. So it's critical that we educate ourselves about the dark side of the phenomenon, because there most definitely is one.
Have human beings been hurt or killed by a non-human intelligence?
I was briefed by a few individuals on the program that there were malevolent events like that.
Decades of research into the abduction phenomenon by Bud Hopkins, John Mack, Carla Turner, David Jacobs, and others suggest that at least some of these non-human intelligences routinely abduct people.
They're taken up into a saucer, usually lasts about an hour.
Complex narratives of being taken by alien beings into UFOs on beams of light.
They do all kinds of experiments. They give them shots, they poke them, they cut them.
What about the insertion of wires and tubes into abductees in the chest, in the kidneys, the ovaries, the wrists, the knees, and the feet, as well as the taking of human body fluids and the injection of unknown substances into the body in various locations?
And there are two crashes that are so important that the government will go to any lengths to prevent you from finding out. And those are two crashes which occurred near the city of Aztec, New Mexico. Why? Because both of those crashed craft contained human body parts.
They do all kinds of things, then wipe out their memory and send them back.
They were embarrassed, ashamed to come forward about it.
And you don't think these were wild dreams,
not
hallucinations?
Not at all. These are very solid people, healthy, mentally healthy people. This is not the way dreams behave. This is not the way mental illness behaves. This is not the way fantasy behaves.
Waking up and finding them standing next to your bed and being terrified. And feeling that, I remember feeling that the world was just not a safe place, that there was nowhere that was safe, that no matter where I went or what I did, that they could find me, and that nobody could help me, nobody could stop it. It was really scary.
Some kind of real experience is occurring to these people, but if this is a real experience, that is some kind of entities, beings, intelligences are entering our world and affecting hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of people according to polls, then this is something really worth looking at. So that's what I've been trying to do, is get people at least look at it, think about it.
I was a graduate student here at Stanford. I was in a used bookstore and buying science fiction books, and I came across a book, and I remember just seeing the cover and realizing that was the face that I had seen when I was a kid looking through the window or in the bedroom. All the skin on my body, like all the hair stood on end when I saw it, and I dropped the book. How does this guy know what I saw?
One thing's for sure, open contact with a more advanced civilization will be the most significant event in human history. How we respond in that moment will determine the destiny of our species. Matt Hurley is a prominent UFO researcher and author of the Alien Chronicles, yesterday's X-Files. Matt is also the founder of Bad-Aliens.info, where he presents a compelling argument supported by chilling evidence that some visitations by non-human intelligences pose a clear and present danger to humanity. I sat down with Matt to explore the recent developments in the disclosure movement, delve into the dark side of the phenomenon, and figure out what we can do about it. Welcome to Night Shift.
There wasn't any particular event that triggered it. I think it was seeing Close Encounters of the Third Kind.
That'll do it.
When I was 18, I read Above Top Secret by Timothy Good, and then that's what got me off down that avenue of UFO research and going to conferences, etc. Joined a local group, listened to other people's points of view, went on a few sky watches, stood in some crop circles in Wiltshire. Then around about 2006, I got a bit fed up with the subject because I couldn't find the answers I was looking for. I'd read all the books on abductions and so on and so forth. I'd looked at channeling, and I literally dropped out the subject. And it was only in 2018 when I read about TTSA in the national press that it got me back into the subject. And a few years ago, someone sent me a link to a website called the Allies of Humanity, and that really was my second seminal moment, and it's really formed the basis or the catalyst for my website and its contents. And my sort of perspective on the subject now is a lot clearer, and I've got a lot more answers since I've read that material. I don't have all the answers, so I live with a lot of questions, but it's answered a lot of questions that I didn't have answers to before.
It's interesting that you put it that way, because I think I stumbled across your website a few times over the years that I've been into this topic heavily, and I've kind of like come up against it, but I haven't seen anyone else really put together the case that you've put together. And I found that I really want to spend some time digging into this with you today, because I think it seems to me like there's a push to not talk about a lot of stuff in this area, and they really don't want that discussion to take off. And I don't know that that's, I can't prove it, but the sense that I get is that there's a real pushback against it, and there's something to that. Can you talk a little bit about maybe where we're at in this particular moment? You said TTSA is what brought you back into the fold.
Yeah.
What's different now, and what do you think's the big picture in this particular moment?
Well, I think one thing that's very different to years ago when I was into the subject is the amount of resources you've got on the internet. All these wonderful podcasts that you can get now. You can glean a lot of information very quickly. Obviously, that comes with the flip side, that there's a lot of rubbish out there you can absorb as well. But there's generally a lot of good resources available now to newbies and to experienced researchers. There's a lot of new people coming to the subject now. What you've mentioned, the TTSA articles. But in terms of ufology, I think there's sort of several demographics. You've got people who are ambivalent. Well, it could be humans from the future. It could be interdimensional beings. It could be a parallel civilization. They haven't quite sort of looked at the data and sort of come to a drill down, honed conclusion on what's going on or what the visitors are. Then you've got the Love and Light Brigade, the New Age community, which is quite a big piece of the pie chart. They're technologically advanced, so they must be spiritually enlightened. There's no way they're going to be nefarious. And their viewpoint flies in the face of what the data shows on my website. And then you've got a smaller percentage of people like myself who see it as nefarious, and very unequivocally, very clearly, that's the picture that we see. I do find it puzzling as to why more people don't have that viewpoint, despite the 80 years worth of data that we've got. I think it might be part of the human psyche, whereby in the face of unknown, you want it to be positive. You don't want to look at it head on and see it for what it is. You know, no one wants the bogeyman. They want something soft and cuddly and fluffy. And everyone's got their own comfort zone. I mean, even within ufology, some people are into abductions, but they don't think cat mutilations are a thing. Some people are into cat mutilations. They don't think there's any human mutilation. So everyone's got their own sort of comfort zone. And for some people, that comfort zone means they won't look at the phenomenon in the way that I do.
Can you talk about, if I understand correctly, I mean, I think you and I share a lot of the same perspective on what is going on, and it seems like you're explain it. Paint the picture for someone who so many new people are coming into this field now, and I feel like a lot of people are completely lost. I have no idea where to start, and there's so much material out there that's channeled, and there's, I mean, it just gets very murky very quickly. Can you give us a real clear breakdown of what do you think is actually going on?
Well, I think
why should we be concerned about it?
Okay, so I think we're being visited by several groups of physical beings from other star systems. There's up to 400 billion star systems in our galaxy. So I think I would go with Occam's razor on that one. I don't think they're anything exotic like interdimensional beings, etc. I think any magic that they display is just an example of their advanced technology. I think people need to remember that. I think we can break the subject down into several key headings. I think we've got the abduction phenomena, where people are taken against their will. I think we've got animal mutilations, where animals are literally mutilated. Parts of them are taken with very high surgical precision. There's also a case of human mutilation, probably not quite as common as the animals, but there are a number of cases where the injuries are very similar to the animal mutilations. And then we've got the David Politis area, where people just vanish under strange circumstances. Sometimes the body's found at a later date in an area that's previously been searched. Sniffer dogs can't pick up a trail. There's other high strangeness around them as well. Sometimes they're missing their footwear. Sometimes UFOs are seen in the vicinity. And there's also what I call UFO attacks, where people have been attacked by craft in Claris in Brazil in the late 70s. For a number of months, people being zapped by UFOs emitting a pencil beam of light. And there's a number of photos of the injuries some of the victims received. In Peru, in the moment, it's quite heavy on Twitter. There's the face peeler phenomenon going on. Where there's been a number of cases where people have been found dead with their whole face missing. So there's several dark categories, if you like. And that's the way my website is structured. I'm showing people different subcategories within the subject, and then I've got a conclusion where I explore why I think it's going on, and further reading that I would recommend to people.
I wonder what is your take on the the airplane video with the orbs?
The airplane, yeah. I'm not an expert on video footage, I have to be honest at the start. So to me, it looks impressive. I haven't really come across anyone yet that's been able to conclusively debunk it. So I'm open-minded about it, to be honest. A few people have said that it was created in 2014, so it would have taken a lot of expertise and a lot of time to come up with something that kind of disappeared off the radar, no pun intended. For many years. It's only recently, in the last few weeks, that it's resurfaced. So that gives it a little bit of providence as well. It's not something like the autopsy footage of Roswell, which appeared in the mid-90s and was an instant smash and had a lot of airtime for many years. This footage sort of was leaked in 2014. And then seemed to disappear off the map for many years and has recently resurfaced again. So have to wait and see, I think, on that one. But yeah, it looks interesting.
There's a lot of I remember there was the alien interview. Do you remember that one?
Yeah, that one, yeah, with the wobbly head in the darkened room. Yeah.
And I think people still go back and forth on that. And then the alien autopsy, I watched that, I think Jonathan Frakes hosted it or something on Sci-Fi Channel once back in 1996 or whatever it was. And I watched that and I was like, oh man, this is it.
Yeah,
and
I used to love watching Sightings back in the 90s.
I watched it like it was a documentary.
Yeah. The problem is with footage today, with CGI, you can create almost anything, and I suppose you need quite a trained eye to work out if it is CGI or not. There's the Skinny Bob footage of the big alien with a big head with the blinking action. That looks impressive, but again, it could be CGI. In some ways, older footage is potentially more compelling because you haven't got that sort of modern tech CGI answer to it,
I think also a whole generation of people has grown up now with really good CGI, and they're I think we're probably close to the same age and remember how bad it was when you saw something really good.
Videos. Yeah, it almost seems though, just as sort of mobile phone cameras have become amazing in their technology, the phenomenon itself seems to be taking a step back. So there doesn't seem to be really amazing footage being taken of UFOs as much as what you would think when you think how good quality mobile phone cameras are and how many people have got them, or cell phones, as you say in the States. So yeah, I do find that a bit odd.
I wonder what your thoughts are on what's going on in Congress right now, and do you think that this has something dramatic changed in the phenomenon itself, or are we just getting hip to what's actually going on?
Well, it's an interesting question, because I mentioned this in my introduction on my website. What if there's a disclosure by the government? What will the aliens do? Will they still remain in the shadows? How will it work out? Because you've got potentially disclosure by the government, and then you've got disclosure by the aliens themselves. So I'm of the opinion that there's competing factions of aliens, just as there are competing factions of humans that want the information out and don't want the information out. So it's a little bit of a complex game of chess on several levels. Yeah, I mean, I go along with the Lou Elizondo idea that there's a faction within government that want the information out. There's another faction that doesn't, and they want the status quo to remain. There does seem to be in the background a sort of a shadow government that seems to have some sort of control over the release of anything to do with the phenomenon that's, substantially compelling, and they've had that grip on the keys, if you like, for many decades. But Grush, in his testimony, seems to know who the main gatekeepers are. So I think now, ideally, we need some sort of skiffs in place, so a lot of these members of Congress can be fully briefed by what, because Grush is dangling the carrot, and we all want to eat it, don't we? So
yeah,
he's got the data, so share the data.
To your point, actually, I remember in the Ross Coulthart interview, the original, the first interview that they put out, David Grush did say that there had been, and his words were, malevolent events.
Yeah.
That resulted in injury and death of service people and civilians, and then they kind of moved on and they didn't really touch it.
Yeah, you can see how it's such a taboo subject within. It's the elephant in the room. If we're alluding at human mutilations, it's the one area that isn't widely talked about, and that was something I noticed when I put my website together. Hang on, because I was looking for information on human mutilations. There wasn't really a website that had every case in the public domain under one umbrella. I had to go here and there in nooks and crannies to try and pull together all the available cases that I was aware of. Richard D. Hall in the UK done amazing research. I've got a lot of his videos on my website, and Chuck Wachowski, I think his name was, who recently passed, on the American side, he did a lot of research into mutilations. But in general, it's not a widely talked about subtopic within ufology. You get the talks on abductions, and mutilations are a sort of a safe house, but the human side people don't seem to like to touch on. But I'm all for let's upturn every apple cart and get it all out there, put it all in under one umbrella, one website, and people can make up their own minds.
It's really astonishing, isn't it, how few people are asking any of these questions, considering how much the media, like every movie is about an alien invasion and they're coming down here to kill us all. And then you talk to people and they're like, well, they would have done it already.
Yeah,
if there was anything to worry. Very strange.
Yeah, I mean, there can be more than one way of taking over a civilization. I mean, people tend to think of it in human terms of coming down with guns and lasers, but maybe there's a long-term plan which is a bit in the shadows. Maybe it involves creating hybrids who will be put into positions of influence within society. So you can take over a planet without ever firing a shot. If you can influence people in certain positions of power, you can obviously exert a great influence over the populace in general, rather than being overt, with your weaponry, if you like. So they might have a very sophisticated way of taking over a planet, and it might be something they've done elsewhere in previous epochs. We may not be the first planet they've done this to.
That's a great point, because there's really no it's not really clear that they need to conquer the planet in the traditional sense to get whatever it is that they need. We don't really know. I think, and I've found that the more I dig into this, the harder it is to find researchers who, like, if I look for I've got David Jacobs' book here on my desk. I've got Bud Hopkins, John Mack stuff, Richard Dolan. Richard Dolan, I find most, and John Mack, I find a lot of their stuff on YouTube, but it looks like Carla Turner, you have to go like on a deep dive to find Carla Turner's stuff. And her
Carla
stuff
Turner's,
is dark.
Yeah. She seemed to get through the bullshit very quickly and seemed to drill down and see exactly what was going on. She could see through a lot of the BS that the aliens impart in terms of propaganda to abductees, saying how they're spiritually enlightened and benign. But she could see through all that and could see there was a nefarious phenomenon going on within abductions behind it all. Unfortunately, she died of aggressive cancer in the 90s. So we've only got a snapshot of research that she's done. I've got about 10 videos of conferences that she spoke at on my YouTube channel, Early Bird Productions, that I managed to cobble together from other sources. So there's a valuable set of videos there for people to watch. She was a great orator as well, had a good command of the English language.
I really appreciated the way that she opened her talks by saying, we only really know what they let us know, and we have no way to verify that any of this stuff is actually true or false. And the predictions that they have given people about what's going to happen and when almost never come true.
Yeah, that's one of the sort of the abductee channeler idiosyncrasies. They always make predictions that never come true. That, you know, people have been shown asteroids hitting Earth for decades and mega earthquakes and pole shift. That was another one that was popular in the 90s. The pole shift was going to occur. It's I suppose if you impart negative scenarios that to people, it sort of puts you in a position of being godlike, and we know what's going to happen. And if you give people constant negative news, it tends to weaken them and put them into maybe more of a submissive state. I imagine there's some sort of psychology book behind why they do that. You know, I think what they're trying to do ultimately is to get people fed up with the status quo and governments, and they want us to look to outside help, so they can then come in maybe in a more overt way and exert an influence on society. And there's this idea as well that the US government was given trinkets from space, a few pristine craft. And once you're in a position where you're receiving technology like that, you're put in a position of vulnerability because you might become dependent on that technology. You know, if I give you a car and I own the keys to the car, you'll do anything to get the keys. So it's kind of a sort of analogy for if you give someone spacecraft and high technology, they'll do almost anything to get more of it because you've got a massive military industrial complex within the US, and all they think about is weaponry and weaponization. And obviously the aliens know that. So that's one of their cards they can play, is to give a few trinkets from space and put senior personnel within the government on a path towards being more vulnerable and wanting more and more.
So in your estimation, that's what's going on in terms of what the government and the connection to this phenomenon.
I go along with the idea that there was some sort of agreement made maybe in the 1950s where we'll give you some technology if we can abduct some people and some animals. That idea has been around since at least the late 80s with John Lear.
John Lear,
yeah. And Grush obviously sort of touched on that, and Ross Coulthard has echoed it as well. I tend to go along that idea. It's come from a few sources now, so it's something we need to look at. And, you know, some of these crafts seem pristine. Well, why would you leave a pristine craft in the middle of a desert? Would you send a party down to retrieve it? Some craft seem to be badly damaged. Was it pilot error? If there's competing races here, did one shoot down another craft? That's another angle some people have come up with. Yeah, I mean, I think John Lear said there was 12 to 15 craft and 3 were pristine. One was being test flown. Grush has come up with a figure, I think, of 12, I think.
I think a lot of the things that Lear said, Grush recently corroborated in some form.
Yeah, so, you know, people laughed at Lear at the time, saying he was really extreme and this is nuts. I do concede, as Lear got older, some of his ideas did get a bit more wild, but I think the original information he imparted to George Knapp on the record in late 1987, I think was maybe closer to the core truth.
My sense is that he had a lot of accurate information, and then they started feeding him off the wall stuff, and he was just like, at that point, he was just going to say whatever he had.
He had he had a friendship with Leonard Stringfield, or he had access to a lot of Leonard Stringfield's research, who was a great crash retrieval expert, and I think he was friends with Bud Hopkins and Whitley Strieber as well. So he was getting abduction info in, and it may have been he had some contacts with the intelligence community through his aeronautical background, and gave him some information. But yeah, as you see over time, then it went a bit iffy. But the initial information seemed to parallel quite a lot with what Grush says.
There was a great, and I often wonder about this one. There was a great, I'm sure you know which one this is. There's a clip of him talking to George Knapp, and George says, what would the president say if they were to announce today?
Yeah.
And he said, well, what could you say? And then he kind of laid out this grand explanation for what's happening. And I wonder how much of it is real. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's a tricky one. How would the public react? Because how would they react to the fact they've been lied to? How would they react to the fact that aliens are here? And then how would they react to the fact that aliens are nefarious and want to take over the planet, and they've been taking people for decades and killing animals? So there's the reaction on several different fronts, if you like. So all in all, it's quite a powerful bomb.
Let's take a moment on the abduction thing, because I think that David Jacobs says in a lot of his work that these abductees are the people who have actually seen inside these craft. They've been inside whatever the facilities are where these people are taken. They've been there. They've seen stuff, and they're the only source of intelligence we actually have about what may or may not be going on. Yeah. And even if you assume, if you factor in for some drift in their memory, on balance, if you look at the number of abduction cases that basically are reporting broadly the same things, there are certain things we can reasonably assume to be true based on just the volume of information we have. What is your take on the abduction phenomenon? How long do you think this has been going on? Do can you flesh that out for us a little bit and talk about what you think may be happening there?
The first official abduction was Willis Boas in the late 50s. People talk about Betty and Barney Hill in the early 60s, but there was Willis Boas in the late 50s. I think he was involved in impregnating a female humanoid-looking entity. But in terms of how long it's been going on for, when you read some abduction accounts, they talk about my grandfather had UFO experiences, and my great-grandfather did. So it may well have gone back into Victorian times. There is this idea that these aliens have been observing the planet for many centuries, and they've waited until we've reached a certain level of technological advancement, because if you want to take over a planet, it needs to evolve to a certain level of technological ability and sort of awareness. It's a lot more difficult to take over a primitive agricultural planet than one that's all wired up with the internet. You can spread your propaganda more quicker, for example, when you've got everyone interconnected via the internet. So abductions may have been going on for a century. Certainly, I'd say since at least the 1950s or even the 40s. But why it's going on? Well, I think ultimately it's to produce hybrids. I think they're taking reproductive material from humans, male and female, and merging it with their own DNA. And their ultimate aim is to create a perfect human-looking form, which looks like us, but is allied mentally to them. And then those individuals be put into positions of power. That's the basic idea that a number of researchers have come up with. I also think as well, some abductees are used for propaganda purposes. So, for example, if someone's had a bad back for 30 years, the aliens might take them on board, cure them, and then they'll go running off to the nearest UFO podcast saying, the aliens have cured me. They're benign, they're positive. So I think there's an element of propaganda going on as well in some cases, with some people who are maybe quite mentally suggestible, who can't maybe see things from afar. So yeah, several reasons as to why they're occurring. And it seems to follow in family lines as well, which is quite interesting. A number of researchers have come up with that idea, or noticed that pattern that they've been following through the family. If you're an abductee, it's likely one or both of your parents would have been an abductee. The other thing as well that's quite compelling for abduction evidence is the evidence of implants where under X-ray foreign objects have been found. And what concerns me is, since Dr. Lair died in about 2014, I don't know if anyone has taken over that organised programme of removing them from abductees, because That's a really solid piece of tangible physical evidence that removes us further and further away from this idea that they're just false memories and it's all in the mind. You've actually got some tangible physical evidence there. And I think he removed about 18 implants during the course of his implant career, if you like. And I don't know if anyone's taken over from his mantle since.
Do you know what the status is of the implants that he did remove? Did they ever get passed on to any other research institution, or did they just kind of go with him?
I think they were analysed by some labs that had certain technology. I think there was evidence of nanotechnology in some of them. A few other curious things about them were when they were put into the body, there was no evidence of insertion. There was no scarring at all. There was no foreign rejection of the object. They seem to have sort of like a membrane around them as well, like a protective membrane. And the curious thing I found about implants is none of them look exactly the same. Some look like a shard of glass.
Mm-hmm.
Other ones seem to have coils of wire come off them on X-ray. So it might be that they're bespoke to the individual's physiology, maybe. And I would think they probably are multifaceted as well. So rather than just tracking the individual, there might be other functions that they perform as well, maybe suggestion or monitoring certain things about the individual. So yeah, a compelling piece of physical evidence that I don't know is still being looked at.
You mentioned a moment ago about how some abductees will get, they'll cure your arthritis or bad back or and it made me think of the Bledsoe case. And I have so many questions about this case. And I've watched almost every interview I can find, and I've tried to figure it out. And it just seemed like so clear to me that he was being shown some kind of hologram, some kind of projection. Like this whole thing was a show. And the way that that Elizondo and all the CIA guys and NASA folks descended on him right after really paralleled a lot of what Carla Turner talked about 20, 30 years ago about how an abductee would get taken, and then immediately after that, the government would start taking an interest in this person. There'd be helicopters and planes and surveillance, and almost like they want to watch this person and see what happens next so that they know they could get some kind of intel.
Yeah, I mean, it was certainly a case rich with data. You had poltergeist phenomena going on, different types of entities. Allegedly, he filmed one. I've seen a still photo of a humanoid in a forest, but allegedly he's got video as well that he's never released. But to me, Chris seems a sort of a religious type person. He's got a religious bent. And as you say, it appears they created this sort of spiritual hologram of the lady, which kind of meets his expectation. This is an individual who's very religious, so he would see that as very significant. And again, he can't step back and look through the BS, if you like, that maybe we can and others can.
And he was given a prediction as well, was he not? About something.
I can't remember what that prediction was. I do vaguely remember, but I'm guessing it's probably some sort of disaster scenario. I can't imagine it being something positive.
Yeah, and which there's so many questions too. I mean, this just dovetails off into a million directions. But it does bring up the question of there's been a lot of talk recently about some kind of an event that's forcing disclosure to move forward at a rapid pace. What do you think about this? Are you aware of this? Do you think there's something going on, or is this just more propaganda?
I think, if the aliens have got a program here, there's obviously going to be a start and a middle and an end. So there's going to be an end point to what they're doing, and then there's going to be an outcome from that end. So it might be within a few years, their program of creating hybrids and inserting them reaches its fruition. It might be as well that there are positive forces out there that want the public to know about ETs and what's going on here. So there might be a program of awareness there that needs to come out ASAP. If not, it's overdue, if you like. So I think there's probably different forces, good and bad, that want to have a program of their own in terms of educating the public.
And I think for a lot of people who are now kind of wading into this topic, the conversation around abductions is something that they usually comes up later, and if at all. And we're so focused on nuts and bolts. And let me go see this, I want to kick the tires on one of these things to know that it's real. And I think you don't even have to read that much. You could just pick up any one of David Jacobs or John Mack's books or Missing Time, and the stories. I've had to put these books down because they're terrifying. I mean, it's just it's disturbing what people say, and I think that the number of abductees that come back and they're psychologically destroyed, they're emotionally destroyed, their lives are torn asunder, and they're completely left with no answers until they go to a hypnotherapist and they get regressed. And the stories they tell are crimes against humanity, I think is a term you've used, right? It's like they're being raped and assaulted and medically experimented on, and these are things that we just, for some reason, people just gloss right over that. And then they go straight to, well, it's Love and Light Brigade. We're all
it's giving special dispensations to aliens where if a human did it, you want them to go to jail straight away. Why are you giving special dispensations to an outside force? People are applying a different set of rules which they shouldn't be doing. We need to exercise prudence over any foreign visitors to our planet, and we need to start with the idea that it's our planet. We have our own sovereignty. And if you start getting narratives that we created you, we've lived alongside you for thousands of years, things of that nature, that's a red flag for me. You know, what evidence have you got for that? I often think when a technologically advanced civilization meets a lower technologically advanced, a lot of the latter will tend to think the former were their creators. And I think if those visitors are nefarious, they'll play on that idea. And you can ultimately end up being in the minority voice, and everyone else is thinking the opposite to you, or they have this general fog of, well, they could be humans from the future. This interdimensional thing I keep hearing all the time as well. Why are you obsessed with what they are? You need to be looking at what they're doing here. That's the main thing. Doesn't matter what star system they're from. You're never going to go there anyway. What are they doing here? Why are they doing it? That's what you need to know.
Yeah, that's a great point. Where do these ideas come from? You know, people will just blindly accept one idea, and then they'll turn around and be like, well, John Lear was full of shit. He was crazy. Like, how could you believe anything that guy said? Meanwhile, we're all going to ascend to the fifth dimension, and everything is going to be rosy.
Yeah, chakras are going to activated. Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest. In the 1990s, I spent a fortune on channeling books because I thought this is amazing. All these people in touch with aliens. I read all the nuts and bolts stuff. That was boring.
Yeah,
is this person in touch with the Ashtar Command? And he's giving all this information: what they eat, what their hobbies are. You know, how long it takes to get from their planet to here. It's amazing. And I got cassettes as well. And after a while, I thought, there's a dichotomy here.
Yeah.
This is all positive. And I'm reading about abductions. I'm reading about animal mutilations, people disappearing. The two opposites. And then I just had an epiphanal moment. I thought, this is a load of BS. It's, you know, I could see how people get attracted to it. And it put me off the subject because then at that point, I just had no answers. You know, who's telling the truth?
It's all, and then you have there's an organized disinformation campaign that's been going on for decades that's mucking up the waters and making it very difficult to know what's real and what's not.
Yeah,
and
you've got aliens impersonating humans. You'll get, in my opinion, some of these black helicopters are holograms. You'll get them over cat mutilation sites. Abductees have been harassed by them as well. I think it's aliens trying to convey the fact that what's happened to you is being done by humans, by some secret group, not by the aliens themselves. So it's that hologram thing coming into play again, like with the lady with Bledsoe. You've got the government lying to you. You've got the aliens being detected. You're sort of fighting forces on several fronts, and it's very difficult to see the wheat through the chaff.
100%, and it's the perfect. We do this to each other all the time. We do this in warfare all the time. We blast the other side with propaganda to weaken their will to fight and their will to resist and to make them pliable. And then I think back to World War II. Tokyo Rose was on the radio broadcasting to troops that all kinds of propaganda just to play with their minds and get them to be more compliant. And this is something that throughout our own human history, all the data that we have says that anytime a more advanced civilization comes in contact with a less advanced civilization, the less advanced civilization is obliterated.
Yeah.
100% of the time. And I don't think it makes no sense to me why we just ignore that altogether and we somehow think that that this is going to be our Star Trek moment and everything's going to just, blossom.
I go along the idea any civilization that comes here is enforcing themselves upon us isn't spiritually enlightened and benign. Those ones will stay off and maybe wait for a future time when we're more ready. Anything that's coming here and is in your bedroom and in your farmer's field, that's not good. They've come here without permission and they've carried out activities without permission. You know, it's the Lou Elizondo, the intruder comes through your house at night, you see footprints in the morning. You know, what's going on there? Are you going to allow that? They haven't identified themselves, where they're from, what they're doing. And it's the same, you know, for these aliens.
Do you find online that there's a pushback against what I guess we're calling the threat narrative? I mean, it seems like people don't want to.
Yeah, I totally get it. You know, everyone wants it to be. Well, there's two things. People will want the phenomenon to be benevolent, because obviously to think of it otherwise is a bit unsettling to the human mind. And also, there's the conspiracy theory that the American government needs extra funding to deal with any threats, which is true to an extent, but obviously, if there is a threat, there's a threat, whether the government wants funding for it or not. You know, you look at the data of what the potential aggressor's doing, and you can put the funding bit to one side and just look at the data, say, yeah, well, I've looked at that, and there's definitely something nefarious going on there. Yeah, I don't formulate my ideas on wanting more money for the government to spend on the military. It's just what I've looked at from what I've arrived at from looking at the data.
It's such a massive. There's so much to try to understand, and there's so few solid facts to grab onto, and we're really left to kind of speculate on a lot of this stuff. But if you think, that's why I love your website, and I wanted to talk to you, because it seems like it's just a breath of common sense that you're bringing to the conversation. And I was thinking about it this morning, and you know, it's hard enough for most people to make. I think most people are okay with the idea of aliens. We're pretty much there. Most people are on board with that. But I think as soon as you start talking about them being here, like really being here, that's when people start to fall off the train a little bit. And if you can get past that, then you've got to go, okay, well, so what does this all mean? It would mean that if there's one civilization, if there's at least one other, there's got to be thousands or millions, an infinite number. I mean, who knows how many, but there wouldn't just be two. It would be crazy. So if they're coming into contact with us, we must assume that they must have had contact with other races for centuries or millennia. And they've done this, they know what they're doing. And here we are, we're this like child race that's barely able to get off our own planet. We have no idea how to handle ourselves in the larger community, which is I'm something I want to get to later. And if you really think about it, there's probably on this planet a few hundred people, maybe a few thousand people in the program who know really what's going on and are actually working on it and trying to figure out like, how do we interact with these beings without dying of some weird pathogen that we have no immunity to, or how. You talked. I saw one of your interviews. You talked about the mental environment. Yeah, and I wanted to ask you about this because it sounded like the way that you were describing it. What is the saying that we're always trying to fight the last war? You know, we're fighting the next war with our strategies from the most recent war. And I wonder, is the mental environment the battle space of the future that humanity just we have no tools to operate in? We just haven't thought about it. It's not something, we're so disconnected from it that are we completely unprepared?
When we look at paranormal phenomena, it sometimes leaves clues that a lot of phenomena that affect the physical have their origin in the mental. So, for example, with poltergeist phenomena, which there's been recordings of throughout the centuries, there's this idea amongst parapsychologists, they've looked into it, that individuals have some sort of trauma or some upset, and if that mental environment affects things in the physical. And I think a lot of these alien races have really focused on those powers of the mind. Even if you look at their brain volume, it looks like they've evolved to use every cubic inch of their brain matter. So a lot of these paranormal phenomena, I think, have a connection to the brain. Psychokinesis, there's been a few people. There's a Russian lady from the 1940s. There's videos of in front of Russian scientists, and she could move objects, and I think she stopped a frog's heartbeat. You know, they did various experiments with her. So we get these snippets throughout time where people, whether it's some sort of genetic thing they've got, what can exhibit powers of the mind. But I think these aliens have got it down to a fine art, and also they're aware of the power of the group mind as well. Several minds pulled together can create quite a powerful force. So yeah. The mental environment is a very strong thing, and it's something that these aliens might be as adept at as well, as much as they are in the physical as well. So their physical technology has evolved over time, and also parallel to that, they've evolved psychic abilities like telepathy. There's accounts of them levitating when they're on the ground as well. In some cases, I've heard the odd anecdote about monks in the Himalayas that can levitate. I met someone once, a reporter who'd seen a monk levitate. Again, we've got these snippets on our own planet of what some of these aliens seem to be able to do on an at-will basis.
It makes you wonder if consciousness turns out to be fundamental to reality, and we have the Monroe Institute, Project Stargate. There's evidence that we've looked at this and found that to be the case. That it represents a branch of the tech tree that we have not really climbed yet. And maybe there's a race of beings out there who've spent the last 10,000 years developing technology on this field of consciousness that we are just now starting to begin to understand. And what would that technology look like? And maybe that's what we're looking at.
Yeah. I think as well, there may be a genetic component to some psychic abilities. So it might be that they've honed in on these certain DNA strands that maybe allow people to be remote viewers, allow them to be psychokinetic. So they've come up with this sort of suite of DNA that allows them to pull all the tricks out of the box, if you like. So I think there may be, how can I put it? I don't think evidence of psychic ability is necessarily due to someone's benignness and their disposition. I think it has a genetic component, and it also involves a lot of mental practice. I think someone could be evil, to put it that way, if you like, still have great psychic powers. These aliens are nefarious. We can see that from what they're doing, but they have psychic abilities. So I don't think psychic ability is necessarily an example of a spiritually enlightened being. I think spirituality is a separate box from the psychic ability. I think that's something that these aliens show to us. That is the case. So yeah, it's a bit like assuming because beings have got high technology that they're spiritually enlightened, and because they've got psychic abilities, they're spiritually enlightened. But the two things are separate.
I think
people who've got no psychic ability who are very spiritually enlightened, there's a lot of permutations.
You just reminded me of that scene in Mars Attacks where Pierce Brosnan is the scientist, and he's talking to the president, and he's like, he's not, and it's clear he doesn't really know what's going on. He's just kind of bullshitting his way through it, and he's like, well, they're super advanced, so we just have to assume that they're going to be peaceful.
Yeah.
And then they just kind of move on from that. Do you think there's a connection? It seems like a lot of stories of NDEs, near-death experiences, and parallel abduction stories to a large extent. Do you find that there's a connection there? What are your thoughts on that?
Only in the sense that recollection of it tends to involve some mental recall. I think they're separate things. I think real abductions are people who are being taken on board a craft, teleported on board a craft through high technology, through a solid wall in a bedroom. Near-death experiences might be a glimpse of some after-death state that's got nothing to do with aliens. I think the aliens are physical beings. They portray themselves as sort of nebulous entities that can flip between the physical realm and the after-death realms. But again, this is the propaganda BS that they're building up. We're not just physical beings that want your animal blood products. We're these nebulous spiritual beings. And I'll stand at the foot of your bed and I'll pull out a picture of your dead grandmother next to me. And then you'll think, oh, they must be in touch with the spirit world as well. Yeah, so they're merging the two realms, if you like, the physical and the spiritual. But I think people need to be aware, well, in my opinion, that they're totally separate, and it's the aliens trying to create more creating a bigger definition of themselves than what they actually are.
I think it's worth mentioning for folks who aren't terribly familiar with the abduction syndrome, as Linda Moulton Howe called it, or the abduction phenomenon, that what exactly happens to a lot of these folks. And you just mentioned these beings will materialize through or pass through a physical wall.
Yeah.
You could lock all the doors and windows of your house, and you could turn on all the, it doesn't matter. And they will come through the physical wall of your home into your room, immobilize everyone in the home, and then abduct one individual and take them physically out of the house. And there are cases, I know David Jacobs talks about this, where other people have been, they're looking for this person. This person's missing for like 72 hours or however long it is. They can't find them. And then they come back and they have no idea what happened. They just think it's 5 minutes had passed.
It's a physical event, as you say. Other people notice the person's not there. The Alsatian dog that normally barks is in a state of suspended animation. You can see where the idea of them being interdimensional comes into play when they go through bedroom walls. People think, oh, they must be interdimensional and they can, pass through solid matter. No, that's their technology, in my opinion. That's the technology thousands of years ahead of us that allows them to do that. There was a great case. I've forgotten the guy's name now. He wrote Incident at Devil's Bridge, Devil's
Terry
Pass.
Lovelace.
Yeah. He had a case where he had his Fitbit watch on, and overnight it had ascended like 20 meters upwards. So, you've got a bit of interesting evidence there that an abduction event had taken place and was recorded on his watch. But
and he was taken with another person too. His companion that he was on I think they had gone on a camping trip. Together out into Devil's Den.
Early on in his life, when he was a child, they both saw a massive triangle and they saw these beings wandering around. He had abduction experiences throughout his life, and I think he was the one where he had a funny sensation in his knee, and he went to the doctors and the X-ray, and they saw this odd implant. And I think when he went back to get it removed, it had vanished. So amazing case. It's one of my favorites.
He's great, and he's very
good speaker as well, very articulate.
Great speaker, and he's really good at just setting up the story and explaining in clear terms what, I think a lot of the stuff can be kind of nebulous, but he's very just the facts. No BS. A very clear
not trying to
case.
flog you anything.
And his experience was another one that he was completely terrified, and I think it's really strange to me how anybody could read any of this and conclude that these beings are benign or helpful.
I think with some people, it's a form of psychological response to deal with a traumatic event. They want it to be benign. So there's a bit of Stockhausen syndrome that might go on maybe, and they start viewing what was a negative event as something that was my kidnappers were positive, to sort of as a psychological mechanism to cope with it. So in some ways, maybe abductees aren't the best person to speak to because they might have a slightly skewed viewpoint. But I think that's in some cases that might be going on.
And I think that might have been part of what put some of these ideas into the community over the years. Some of these folks were abducted and possibly even fed disinformation and sent back to go to these conferences and talk to everybody about how
it's a very effective tool. You get a guy who's very charismatic but is easily suggestible. Give him the data, program him, and bang, off he goes.
It seems clear to me, when I look at it, what's happening right now, it looks to me, and I'm not an expert in this, but just common sense, that there's some kind of an information war going on right now, and that's what Lou Elizondo was all about. Lou Elizondo, why were these guys who were like all these CIA intelligence guys on like Joe Blow's podcast that has like my podcast has no like nobody's listening to it, but why these guys who've been doing this for 30 years and they've got all this, they're just going around doing the podcast circuit, but it's a very, very small circuit in a small community of people. And why would they be doing this? And I really can't, it's got to be about hearts and minds. They have to be laying the foundational groundwork for something else that they're trying to do, to push through this legislation, to get that support so that Congress can go through and start to peel this onion.
There's a funny idea that some researchers don't want the truth out because they lose their job. That they're professionals within the UFO circuit. They do all the talks and the lectures, and there's this idea that they don't want the truth to come out and it all to end because they're out of a job. They want to perpetuate the mystery. So that could come into play as well. I think some people don't want the answers. They want to go on a podcast and explore lots of potentials and think of it as an academic, intellectual hobby rather than something that's very black and white and serious.
Yeah, it does seem like there's some of that, and it's hard to know. Well, my red flags go off every time I hear like secret space wars with so and so was a space marine serving on some like distant galaxy.
I spent 10 years on Mars.
Yeah, 10 years on Mars, and I'm like, okay. Well, you speak about on your website Allies of Humanity.
Yeah.
Marshall Vian Summers.
Yeah.
Can you set this up a little bit for folks and explain how you arrived at this material and what your sense of it is?
Okay. So a couple of years ago, someone sent me a link on social media to a website called the alliesofhumanity.org. So I clicked on the link, I looked at it, I thought, oh no, it's channeling. Because as I mentioned earlier, I looked at channeling years ago, thought it was a load of BS. So I thought I'll give it a read. So I'm going through, I think, God, this is a bit dark and a bit gothic. It's talking about people going missing. It's talking about people being dismembered and their body parts being sold for trade in the galaxy. It's talking about hybrids being created. It's talking about animal mutilations. It's talking about alien bases. It's talking about craft being given as trinkets from space to certain personnel within the US government. I thought, this is the sort of information that I was looking for years ago within channeling that I was never finding. What I was reading was information about ascension and the beings of spiritual enlightened and everything's going to be fine and we're going to join the Galactic Brotherhood. This information now was very raw and very dark, and it resonated with me. And I thought, this has definitely got a niche within the channel marketplace. It's totally different to anything else I'd seen. There was no C word. It didn't mention consciousness. Very black and white, plain English, no highfalutin New Age language, New Age psychobabble, I call it. None of that. And I read all 4 volumes within the space of a few days. It's all available free online, which was another plus point. No quick buck to make there. And then, so once I read that, I thought, well, where's this information come from? And I found a website then talking about Marshall Vian Summers. He's an elderly gentleman who lives in Colorado, and he channeled this group of 5 beings. They're physical beings. They're not nebulous spiritual beings. They represent 5 different star systems in our galaxy, and what they're doing, what their mission, because they're on this mission, they're acting as cosmic spies. They're spying on all the aliens that are on Earth, because as we've outlined earlier, we're not going to get the answers from them. They've been giving out conflicting statements for many years. So I read this information, and for me, it really resonated. It took me a long time to get to that information, and it answered a lot of questions I had about the phenomenon. It got me really engaged back into the subject. And within a couple of days, I thought, I need to create a website. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to structure it. I'm going to list all the phenomena I think are associated with the subject: abductions, mutilations, missing people, etc., etc. In the conclusion, I'm going to mention the Allies of Humanity, because for me, that's clearly explaining what's going on. And then I'm also going to mention about Marshall Vian Summers, who I'm going to talk about now. So Marshall channeled them, as I said, in the 1990s. He's also written a lot of books on spirituality. He talks a lot about the powers of the mind, about our spiritual side. His basic idea, his basic thrust is the idea that we have our normal everyday mind with all its quirks, its anxieties, its materialism. And then within each being, you have what's called a spiritual mind. And through practicing stillness, a lot of those edges within our normal mind get smoothed out, and the spiritual power, the mind within us, starts to open up, and we become a more rounded individual. Also, as well, it gets a little bit woo now, but there's the idea that all physical beings in the universe have got what you call a soul or a spirit. They've all got this spiritual power potential within them. And there's also the idea that he talks about that a lot of these beings can speak to each other through spiritual power or knowledge, he calls it, and it's not knowledge as information, knowledge with a capital K. He talks about his spiritual power, and there's like this massive network of spiritual beings within the universe, and you have like a sort of a pyramid structure. So it sort of matches a lot of what basic occult books have said for several hundred years. You have this sort of this sort of hierarchy of spiritual beings, and they're all ultimately interconnected. And the idea is when you incarnate, because you reincarnate, that's one of his things he talks about. You will reincarnate in the physical realm from the spiritual realm. You spend a certain amount of time out of it, and you come back into Earth, and you've got some sort of mission to fulfill. Mm-hmm. It's not like being a millionaire. It might be to do with saving the environment, something altruistic. And if you can tap into your spiritual packet of power within you, that mission, if you like, will impinge itself within your normal mind. Mm-hmm. So I'm not very good at talking about the spirituality sort of stuff, but because I'm not very good at meditation. It's very easy to talk about something. It's harder to practice it.
Sure.
So I would urge people to read his material. It's all available free online. That's the basic idea, that we're spiritual beings. All these aliens are also spiritual beings as well. Some of them evolved genetically, so that spiritual component within them is quite inhibited. So they tend to come across in a very sort of robotic way, if you like. So yeah, that's a very brief précis of the universal view.
It's interesting because it touches again on that whole notion of consciousness being fundamental to reality, almost like there's a consciousness field that's like sort of the telepathic internet that's just on all the time, and all these different beings are able to communicate, but we haven't figured out modems yet.
There's this sort of beautiful idea that these spiritual beings that you may not be aware of, and they could be the other side of the galaxy, and they could be influencing you in some way. There's a sort of interconnection, but you will never necessarily know it was occurring. Because obviously, once you become conscious of something, there's the idea, the ego builds and so on. So there's a lot of subliminal stuff that seems to go on in the background that can influence people in a positive way that they're not really aware of.
Do you subscribe to this idea that I think I know Tom DeLonge has mentioned the consciousness connection a number of times, and he's talked about the dangers of CE5 and sort of the riskiness of trying to just open that door.
Yeah.
What do you make of that? And
Well,
do you think there's more to that?
I think CE5 is highly responsible for the reasons we've laid out already. A lot of these people who would do CE5 wouldn't get into a car with a stranger. So why are you handing over? Why are you handing over? It could be Ted Bundy in the car. You don't know, do you? Might be good looking and a nice personality, but you don't really know who's there. So why are you handing over special dispensation to aliens just because they come from somewhere else and talk telepathically? Why does that necessarily make them? Right, it's that human hope. It's the hope, isn't it? It is exciting. You can see it's exciting, isn't it? Wow, I might be getting in touch with some foreign intelligence. I'm fed up watching soap operas on TV. I want some excitement in my life. I'm going to sit on a field and see if I can call in some craft and make my life more exciting. So you can see the basic human attraction to that hobby, but I can now also, because I used to do it myself, hands up, I can see now why it's a dangerous hobby, and I wouldn't recommend anyone to do it.
I think going back to something you said a minute ago about the way Marshall described sort of the hierarchy of beings, if you will, I think people have a hard time with the non-physical reality that seems to be very real, and it's very much, indigenous people have known this forever, and we're just now catching up to it. But if you talk to any indigenous person, it's a very real phenomenon. I remember I did a ayahuasca ceremony. My wife's Peruvian, and we were in Peru, and I had the opportunity, and I did one. And I remember how much prep. There were 2 weeks of prep you had to do just to go into the ceremony. And the medicine man who administered the ceremony spent hours prepping the space. And I was told later that was because when you open this gateway, when you open this door, things will follow you. If you don't set it up correctly, there's a way to do it. And and it made me wonder, to a certain extent, indigenous people seem to have a handle on this that the rest of us don't have. How to work. And if you think about reality as just a continuum, there must be the physical dense level, and then it just continues on. Why would we only think life could evolve once Earth reaches a certain point and is and in this very particular way? Why couldn't it evolve as pure energy on another plane?
Something starts from something else. There has to, as you drill down, there's always another level. As your scientific instruments become more sensitive, they'll pick up smaller and smaller particles. So there's going to be many layers of the onion, if you like. And throughout history, we've had examples of paranormal phenomena which seem to indicate there's more to life than meets the eye that aren't explainable by physics. So it's good looking at all these things and putting together some sort of framework of what you think reality might be. I'm
curious a little bit about. So I dug deeply into Marshall's material, and I started to. There's a lot. There's a lot to read. But I've been doing my best to work through it, and I watched a number of his videos. And I'm curious about. You said before you were turned off by the whole channeling thing. But that's obviously what he claims to be doing. So was it just the message, the being so different that stood out as an outlier to you?
I mean, I had all these unanswered questions within ufology as to what the agenda of the aliens were, and in black and white, clear English, the Allies of Humanity material told me what it was. Whatever the truth is, it has to match what you're seeing in the field. If people are going missing, then you need to be reading channel that's addressing that. If people are being abducted, then you need to be reading that in messages, and so on and so forth. So, if you were to ask someone, what's it like in North Korea, and they totally circumvented any mention of the lack of freedom, that's my analogy for 99% of channeling. It's circumventing all the dark stuff. So you need to find, use your discernment. So who is addressing these activities that are occurring? Well, for me, I see it in the Allies of Humanity, and that's what I've built my website on. My backbone is the Allies of Humanity.
I want to come back to the North Korea thing because you just made a great point about that. And but before I do, so the obvious question is, and I think a lot of people would be asking this: why just Marshall? Why, if again, the message is, be concerned, be aware, this is happening, prepare yourselves. Well, why not make that message clear in a much more obvious way?
Well, not have 10 marshals. Well, the problem with then is you'll have people saying, well, this marshal said that, and that one had a slightly different nuance to me. So I think the idea is, by just having one messenger, there isn't this sort of risk of people comparing one message to another, or seeing something in one that isn't actually there. I think you're sort of diluting and making the message potentially more messy. Whereas if you've just got one mouthpiece, it's just clear clarity. No outside influence. Yeah, that's the idea.
The North Korea thing is interesting because if you, that's a case where we do bombard them with broadcasts of television shows and movies, and people fly balloons over North Korea and drop thumb drives with Western media, all to fight this psychological war against the Kim regime. And this is something that we're doing every day, all the time. And so it's not unheard of. This is just a very basic, simple tactic that gets used everywhere.
I think a sophisticated race will use tactics that use the least amount of energy but have the most effectiveness. So if you can build antennae in underground bases and send out subliminal messages to people in the surrounding area, that's a very easy, hands-free way of influencing people. And in that case, you're using technology to influence people's minds. And that's one of the pieces of information that the Allies of Humanity mentioned, that some of these underground bases have got antennae in them that they use to send out this sort of subliminal information, which is why maybe people like us are in a minority and we're fighting a big opposition. We're having to try and suggest alternative ideas to people that they may not embrace.
It really does feel like that movie They Live. where most people are just kind of like, I just want to go to work and
Yeah.
I can barely afford groceries. I don't have time to think about, and what would I do even if, okay, so assume this is all true and they are coming here to take over. Now what? Like, what am I supposed to do about that?
Yeah.
I've got bills to pay.
I wonder what would society be like if the Roswell crash was shown to the public at the time? What path would we be on now? We would have had exposure. The ontological shock would have taken place 75 years ago. Where would we be now? It's almost as if we're massively overdue now to have this final disclosure. Ideally, it should have happened 70 years ago.
One really key thing that jumped out at me from Marshall's work was that there seems to be this idea in ufology that resources past a certain point of advancement are not an issue anymore. And like, if a sufficiently advanced race wouldn't need Earth, because anything we would have here, they can get anywhere else, like an infinite amount. Except, we're also told, if you look at like just mainstream science, that we're the only planet like us anywhere. And so we are completely unique in at least this region of space, so far as we could tell. And the biological diversity is the real value. Right?
Yeah. The Atlas of Humanity talk about the fact that in this sector of the galaxy, that our planet is one of the few jewels that's got a very rich biodiversity. And they also talk the idea with some races, they become so technological, they strip all the resources of their planet. If you take a digital watch, for example, how many different components has it got in it compared to, say, a wind-up watch? More technology, you need more resources. You take that on a sort of on a civilization path that's been going on for thousands of years, advancing, they strip all their resources. So then they become dependent on trade with other civilizations, or they become they get taken over and absorbed into a sort of a big group, if you like. They might have been given some trinkets from space to make them vulnerable in their prehistory. So they end up then becoming part of this empire, if you like. And then they become a collective of cosmic scavengers that are then looking for resources elsewhere. And it's kind of the law of the jungle, if you like, in the universe. That's the picture the Atlas of Humanity takes. You've got all these physical beings, and some of them are friendly and are very spiritually enlightened, but there are these other ones that are just purely robotic in thought and just want your planet's resources. So what they also say as well is you get some civilizations that have a balance between the technology and the spiritual ethical, if you like. They might have they might be big into green issues. They might have a low emission status on their planet. They might have their population under control. They might not be overpopulated, etc., etc. Certain pointers that you would expect in an enlightened society, and those ones don't tend to be dependent on trade. It emphasizes in the Atlas of Humanity that certain civilizations of that kind tend to be very independent. They're in their own sort of ecosystem, if you like, and they tend to sort of keep themselves away from outside intruders. Once you sort of get sucked into deals with other civilizations, that's when issues can arise. So there's the idea of autonomy with a lot of very spiritually enlightened civilizations. They're Switzerland, and they don't want they don't want their paradise damaged.
Yeah,
use a crude metaphor.
That's a great metaphor. The autonomy, and then the other one you hear a lot is the free will.
Yeah.
We have to choose to want to ascend to the next whatever. And I often, whenever I hear that, and if I'm describing it right, I think the idea is that people say, well, why haven't they just made open contact? Mm-hmm. And I think the counter argument is we have to take care of our own problems first, and then once we reach a certain point, that would happen.
Yeah.
And I always, whenever I hear that, I wonder, we don't have all the information. So how can free will be a factor? How can you say to someone in North Korea, well, just fix it?
Yeah.
Just fix your problem country, and then suddenly and then you can just join the rest of us and have McDonald's on every corner, and it's going to be great.
I think we're obviously a mixture of different societies and tribes, and we've got different quirks. And I think really we need a massive reboot. so everyone's on the same page. So if you had disclosure, at least you would have that reboot factor kicking in. So it would allow us to maybe reevaluate lots of things and lots of values about society. We're sort of double blind in a way, because as well as the lack of ET awareness, there's also the spiritual afterlife reincarnation side of things as well, which isn't widely accepted. Some societies on planet Earth are very secular and aren't really interested in that. I mean, in some places it's taboo to research. So, you could argue parapsychology could have developed a lot quicker if various societies were more open to it. There's faced a lot of criticism and backlash from orthodox science. Maybe if science was a bit more open-minded, we might have made a lot of progress towards evidence of afterlife. Maybe materialization seances might have been a bit more widely looked at, for example. So we're double blind, but we've got the ET lack of awareness and the sort of spiritual afterlife lack of awareness. So we're kind of double blind in a way.
Are you familiar with the Monroe Institute material? And
I think I've read the books years ago. Yeah, I'm familiar with. They did a lot of like NDE research, if I'm right.
Yeah, but for those who aren't, the Monroe Institute was founded by this gentleman who he owned radio stations, and he had a out of body experience, and he was a very nuts and bolts, grounded businessman, multi-millionaire business guy, owned a bunch of radio stations. And then he one night had this out of body experience where he physically felt that he was floating above his body. He looked down, he saw his wife, he saw his own body, he was bumping up against the ceiling. And he was so distraught that he wound up going to his doctor just to see what was wrong. And the doctor couldn't figure it out. And he decided that he would go back and have his team, he would put a team together of people working for him to figure out what was happening. And I think that my understanding is that they basically worked out they could use sound frequencies to induce different levels of sort of a meditative state, a mental state with a particular binaural beat or a frequency combination. And they could accelerate, you could drop into a meditation and then suddenly access this other level. And then he developed a whole curriculum on how to do this. And then the CIA contacted him, and basically, I could be wrong here, but I believe that was the beginnings of what later became Project Stargate and the whole remote viewing program, and all of that kind of came out of that. But that was just one example of somebody who basically put some scientific resources into it and got an enormous
one experience, and bang, he was off down an avenue, and that put him on his path.
Yeah.
It's interesting how the military are often the ones that have make the most progress. Obviously, you see it with technology, but also on the mental psychology side, the military come in and remote viewing. Let's look at that, and they're often the ones that have got the biggest funds to look at those things. Ironically, the military. You would think it might be something more altruistic, but they're often the guys that make the most advances in research in some of these areas.
Well, I think that goes back to what we were talking about a little while ago about, let's assume that this is all very real and that there is a threat and there's a group of people here that know about it. And my wife is a big fan of the show Stargate. I don't know if you watch Stargate. The show for the Stargate in the 90s ran for like 32 seasons. It was on forever. This is the popular show based on the movie. And she, for one, she's convinced that Stargate was a soft disclosure, because there's a lot of, every time I tell her about some new UFO stuff, she's like, that was season 4, episode 14. I put that in there. But there's a group of people somewhere that are basically like that. They're the crew of the Enterprise. They're in charge of dealing with this on the daily. They go in on a Monday, they punch in, and then suddenly it's like that building in Men in Black, where there's just, that's real to some degree. And what what it looks like and how all that works, we don't know. But we know that there must be people who are dealing with this, and their job. And Elizondo has talked about this. I think he said, one day when we look back at the history of this whole thing, once that's known, people are going to look at these folks as patriots and heroes, visionaries, for basically taking the last 75 years to just figure out what the hell's going on and how do we confront it? What tools do we need? Do we need we have to figure out anti-gravity. We have to figure out faster than light travel. We have to figure out what this material, how you can materialize through walls, and how do you defend against that, so that we can have that moment where when disclosure does happen or when open contact does happen, we have the tools to not just be completely railroaded and run over by this thing.
Yeah. I touch on remote viewing on my website, and it was quite interesting. When we look at the history of like Project Stargate, I think it was called, they quickly came across alien bases. You know, they were doing all these remote views around Earth, and then after a while, it was Joe McGonigal, I think, or one of the famous names, started coming up with all these. That's it. Started coming up with these alien base locations around the world, and they were seeing these like non-human entities inside these bases. So yeah, that's a good tool that we can use, or the military can use, to try and ascertain what sort of presence there is on Earth. You know, and obviously if they're double-blind experiments and you're getting corroboration from other remote viewers, that they could be hitting the bullseye there in terms of accuracy.
Was that the one that? There was one story in particular where they remote viewed a base, and then in the middle of the session, the remote viewer, and I don't remember which one it was, who it was one of the really, really like Top Gun remote viewers, was like, they know I'm here.
Yeah,
they just saw me, like they could see.
Oh my God! Yeah.
Then had to like get out.
It's that there. That just put the willies up you a bit. That one, yeah. I feel that in another remote viewing sessions where they're aware, the target's aware that they're being watched. I think I can't remember the name of the guy. There's a famous psychic, and he did some remote views of the moon, and the beings on there were aware that they were being watched by him. So it was a sort of a similar experience. I can't remember the name of the guy now. He was the one that could change weather, and he had a book written on him by the chap that presents that channel. He won the Bigelow Award for Evidence of Life After Death.
I don't know about this. What's this? Tell me more. The Bigelow Award for Life After Death. So
Bob Bigelow, who bought Skinwalker Ranch, he had a prize competition about a year or two ago, and you had to write a thesis, best evidence for life after death. I think his wife might have died prior to that, so he was looking at that side of things. And the chap, You Thinking Aloud, it's called. It's a YouTube channel.
Jeffrey Mishlove.
Jeffrey Mishlove, yeah.
I love his channel.
Jeffrey Mishlove wrote a book. I can't remember the name of the title of the book, and I can't remember the name of the guy in the book, but this guy was a mega psychic. He had contact with aliens, and he could remote view locations, one of which was the moon, and he could see these beings on there, and they were aware of him. Yeah, so sort of parallel to what we were saying earlier about the other case with the American military.
And that's a whole nother deep dive, because for people who are new to the remote viewing thing, these are people who have been proven to be able to look inside a locked safe in a room on the other side of a building and read the numbers off of a card inside of an envelope. Like, they're that good. And I think Richard Dolan's wife is also a remote viewer.
Crazy, yeah.
And he talks about this a lot. In fact, Richard Dolan, a lot of the stuff that you talk about, it seems like he's another one who's of that same mindset, that there is
there's a nefarious element to it. Yeah, he's definitely said that on the record. Yeah.
And he seems to be convinced that the timing of this is related to our advancement, so that once we reach a certain point, which I still have trouble with, because I still think, I mean, it would be a lot easier to take advantage of the planet if your whole population is in the Stone Age. I don't understand why you'd wait until they all have 5G. It seemed like, when there's 12,000 people on the whole planet, that's your time to come in and do whatever.
Yeah.
But maybe we're advancing despite that, and now that's what's forcing it, is either the fact that we're destroying the biosphere and that's what's valuable to them. I don't think it's us.
Yeah. I think they don't want a nuclear war to take place on Earth, so they want to keep damage to a minimum so they can take over the resources. If you're going to buy a shop off someone, you don't want the occupants to damage it before you take it over. So there's a bit of an analogy there for planet Earth. Remote viewing, it's an interesting tool. I think a lot of researchers like Dolan, I think they probably have a stronger stance than what they're telling you in public, because they've got professional
Sure.
stance. They have to come across as quite measured, but it'd be interesting to speak to them off camera. They might have a more colourful things they would like to say that they don't actually say on camera.
One of the scariest interviews I've ever seen was the one, not scary, but existentially just terrifying, was the Richard Dolan interviewing David Jacobs. I don't know if you've seen that.
Yeah, I've seen that one. Yeah, that's one of my favorites. Yeah.
Oh God, one keeps me up at night.
Yeah.
And in that, for those who don't know about Richard Dolan, he's a historian first. He's actually a historian by trade, and got into ufology by studying from a historical perspective. He just wanted to look at why are so many people saying they're flying saucers. This is an anomaly in history. It seems like a really weird thing. And then he started to study the history of it and basically found himself to be a believer.
Yeah.
And just couldn't look any other way. It seemed so obvious. But I lost my thread. Where was I going with that? The interview with David Jacobs. David Jacobs says that he's actually scared for his children. He's convinced that there is a plan unfolding to create this hybrid force, and I think the number that he came up with was in the millions. The number of abductees they estimated in the millions.
It's difficult to estimate numbers. That's something I tend to stay at speculation. I haven't got a clue, to be honest with you, into the numbers. What concerns me is you have this cohort of great researchers like Jacobs, Hopkins, Carla. Jacobs is quite elderly now. I think he's retired. Hopkins and Carla have passed away. I don't know if there's
and John Mack
coming through. John Mack. I don't know if there's enough people coming through with the same sort of gravitas and ability that they had. It almost seems that there was a peak in abduction research maybe 10, 20 years ago, and it sort of hit a wall. Jacobs came with the not as Hopkins or Jacobs that came with the hybrid idea originally, but that's been around for a few decades.
Yeah.
Jacobs has written 2 or 3 books on the subject, and I don't know really if abduction research has advanced much since then. The implant retrievals seem to have stopped. Maybe they're still going. I'm not aware of any overt program. So I don't know really whether it's almost like the abduction research is a sort of a window of time that we've kind of passed the peak. The zenith was achieved a few decades ago, maybe.
Did you notice too when you were your first go around with this topic? I noticed that the most vicious it seemed like abductees were treated worse than almost anybody else in this conversation. When they were brought on television. I watched a clip the other day. There's an Oprah Winfrey clip when she's interviewing some folks who were abducted and claimed to be, and it was clear that they were traumatized people. And whether or not you believe in aliens at all, these are people who were suffering from a mental health moment, a crisis in their lives that had destroyed their lives. And here they are, they're coming on this show, and she's basically laughing at them. She's like, well, how could it be bad? I mean, I want them to come take me aboard the beam me up, and they just make it so corny and cheesy.
Vulnerable people who were very brave going on TV and facing a lot of flack and sarcasm from the audience and the host. Absolutely, yeah. And you look back at them now, and it's a snapshot in time where people were a lot more cruel and not as aware. I might still be a certain amount of flack now, but maybe not quite as hardcore as it was then. And they're seen as brave people, and time will serve them well. They'll always be respected for having the balls to go on telly when a lot of other people wouldn't have done. It's the old pioneer thing, isn't it? You'll always get laughed at first. First ones on the block will get laughed at, and then those that follow have an easier ride. And that's the same for a lot of things in life, I suppose.
I think it's clear to me that part of the campaign that David Grush talked about to basically push this issue to the margins and make it something that is just a silly issue, that was in full effect in the 90s. That was really heavy. And for folks who are younger, folks may not remember that, but I think during that time, it was really clear. This was the very first time we were seeing a lot of people come forward and talk about this stuff. That's when John Mack was out doing a lot of his talks, and even Harvard. And John Mack was a heavyweight, and his own department basically tried to throw him out over this. He was one of the only researchers at the time who was really looking at it going, look, either these people are all hallucinating the same thing, which in itself is crazy by itself. We should look at that. Or if 10% of what they're saying is true, if 5% of what they're saying is true, we have a huge issue. This is enormous.
I think there's a lot of scientific orthodoxy. On public, they'll say one thing, but in private, they might have a different opinion because they've got research grants and they've got to maintain a particular public stance. Behind the scenes, some of them, a subset, may have an actual interest in the subject. It might be the same for like near-death experiences. You might have a psychologist who's very skeptical on camera, but off camera, they might have a different opinion. So there could be a bit of like double speak going on.
And there's a little inertia still. You know, you see folks like Neil deGrasse Tyson comes up a lot, and just pushing back really hard against this conversation. And I think we're going to get to a point where they're going to have some explaining to do on.
Yeah, they force themselves more and more into a deeper hole, and if disclosure occurs, they're going to look fools really for not being more open-minded at an earlier stage. So they've had several opportunities to reevaluate their previous position. Yeah.
Do you have a solid stance or position on the different races that people describe? Linda Moulton Howe has done a lot of work in this area, and John Lear talked about sometimes he would say there's at least 5 different civilizations, and then later I heard something like 18 or 20. How anybody could really know this, I don't know, but we know that there are grays. We hear reports of reptilians. We hear reports of mantis beings. Those are the big 3: tall grays, short grays.
Linda loves their alien taxonomy. Whenever I watch a show, she's always saying this race is from this star system, and this one's from that one, and these guys from here. I don't know how you can be that specific, but what the Allies of Humanity say is, again, this matches the data, that some of these groups are multi-ethnic. So you might have one group from one massive spaceship or planet. It might consist of a short grey, a tall grey, a reptoid. It isn't like one ethnicity from one star system, that they're multi-ethnic groups. So it's quite complex because you've got multi-ethnic groups and more than one group. Also, as well, because we can't determine friend from foe, what the Allies of Humanity said, there's no beings here now that are benevolent. Any craft or beings people see are here for their own reasons. They're not here for our benefit because we haven't got that discernment. If we had positive beings in the mix, you would have an ambiguous situation then. Well, have I met a friendly alien or a nasty one? The Allies of Humanity don't say what they look like, because obviously if they did, then the negative ones would start implanting images in people's minds of what the good guys look like. So it's a bit of a game of chess going on. You don't know what the good guys look like, but anything here now, they say, isn't here for our benefit. So it's multi-ethnic and more than one group. I mean, there's at least 5, aren't there? You've got reptoid, insectoid, tall grey, short grey, some human-looking ones. So I'd say at least 5, but I don't know what the total is. I don't know.
Yeah, and these stories, if you just take it at face value, you talk. Some of these abductees will tell you, I was in my room, I was asleep, my wife was asleep next to me. These little beings walked through the wall. They were in the room. Suddenly, I'm float through the ceiling. I'm on board a craft. There's an 8-foot praying mantis being, and then I'm terrified. And then suddenly, I was overcome with this feeling of the deepest, warmest love and caring, just washed over me. And I think to myself, as soon as I heard that, I would think, this is like those you read about some insect that can take over another animal, and or a parasite that can get into their brain. And I wonder, is this a weapon that they use, this psychic weapon? They just shower you with this feeling of warmth and love and just disarm you. And how can you resist if you feel so?
It could be more biochemical.
Fantastic.
It could be that they've worked out how the feel-good juices in the brain work, and they might have the ability to press that button so you get a massive endorphin hit, so you have that feeling of well-being, of love. So it might be that they're very adept at knowing how to release these feel-good chemicals in the brain. So
it's just like giving somebody a gallon of morphine, or whatever.
The abductee will go away. Like I said, I had a great experience. It was so spiritual, but all they may have done is to give you like a massive feel-good chemical factor shot and released all those positive hormones in your head that you come away thinking, oh, I had a great experience. 8-foot mantis, but it was a lovely experience.
Yeah, it's like what they describe and the way that they feel after the fact make no sense whatsoever, like at all. It would be the most terrifying thing in the world. I can't imagine anything scarier than that.
What I find weird, when you think of like a mantis and their sort of appendages, you wonder how they can sort of be adept with like medical instruments. I mean, I don't know the nuances of how things work, but you wouldn't have thought their sort of appendages would be equipped for doing fiddly operations, but who knows how it works.
There's a great clip recently of Gary Nolan talking about this. Did you see the thing where he talked about, I think he was on Tucker Carlson's podcast, which I don't watch, but I did catch this clip, and he said, he openly said, he's like, what we think we're seeing with the Greys are they are some type of a biological robot that is sort of the minions, were his words. And they are the ones that, and David Jacobs says the Greys are the workers. They're the worker beings. If someone pukes, they're the ones who clean it up. If someone, when they take off your shoes, the Greys are the ones who go put them away and bring all that stuff back out. And then the Mantis beings seem to be in the background a lot. Most people don't see them all the time. And then there's the tall Greys, and it's the taxonomy gets complicated, but I think those are like the big three.
What the allies say is, echoing what you're saying, is there's a strict hierarchy within these ethnic groups. So each ethnic group will perform specific functions. So you've got the Greys at the bottom, which it says in the allies that they were sort of artificially created over a period of time as a worker class, if you like. They do say actually they are sentient beings. They do have a spirit, but they're atrophied from it. So their whole genetic makeup is to not be interested in spirituality and any inquiries into that. It's purely task-driven, time-efficient. So they're like robots. They're robot-like, but they're not actually robots. That's what they say anyway. And you have this hierarchy then of different beings doing different things, and everything's very strict. And they make North Korea look like Disneyland. They lack so much freedom. Although we might be marveling at the technology and what they can do, their actual day-to-day lives are very limited. And if you look at some of those civilizations, there's a total lack of freedom, and they're just very technological in nature.
That brings to mind, and I know I sound like a broken record with David Jacobs. I've just been reading his stuff lately, so it's fresh. And it was he talks a lot about how the early generations of hybrids, abductees would be brought on board and then given a baby. A woman would be given a child, a hybrid child, and told to hold this baby, and I guess to bond with it the way that we would try to get an animal in a zoo to bond with another animal, something along those lines. And that initially the early generations were very much not human looking at all. And then subsequently over the years that became more and more to a point where they're indistinguishable from people. And he said that and I still have a hard time with this, that hybrids would come back. They're brought back and put into kind of like halfway houses sort of situations where they're training to live and act and behave like people, but a lot of times they just don't. There's a whole lifetime of experience that they don't have, so they don't know like what spaghetti is, or they don't know how to, I don't know, do very human things like drive a car, or what a show on TV is about, and so they seem very awkward and weird if you come across one, because there's just so much that they don't know. Yet they do have the ability to affect us and influence the way you think, put thoughts in your head. Jim Semivan has talked about that they can put thoughts in your mind.
It makes sense though, isn't it? If you've got a program where you're trying to hybridize yourselves with another species, it's going to be an incremental development over a period of time. It's not going to be instant hybrid, 100% A1. So to me, that makes sense that you'd have this process of gradual refinement over time. And then obviously you would then need to put your creation into real physical surroundings, 3D surroundings, and then monitor how they cope with things. And so, it's a long-term program, as the Allies of Humanity say. It's not a 10-year program. They don't say how long the program is, but we can see through looking at Jacob's data that it's improving over time. So maybe we're not a million miles away from D-Day, if you like, when this program comes to fruition or to the next stage, the next level.
Do you have any thoughts on reports of people seeing humans on board these craft working alongside these other beings?
I think some people that are taken, like missing 411 type people, some of them are used, held in captivity on board craft or underground bases, and they may well be used as a conduit between the aliens and people they take on board. If you're an abductee, you're taken on board a craft, I suppose you'd like the familiarity of seeing other humans. Also, as well, the propaganda thing. The abductee comes back to us and says, "Oh, there's humans working alongside the aliens. Everything's hunky dory." When actual fact, they've been abducted, may have undergone some sort of brainwashing to put them into a specific role or task. I think we also have to bear in mind that these aliens can project an image into someone's mind. So if someone goes on board a craft and sees a bunch of humans, they may just be comfort projections to pacify the individual. That's why I don't buy massively the MyLab thing. I think that's a propaganda thing created by aliens. We're not abducting you. It's humans in suits doing it. You just create the image of men in uniform, and then
can you tease that out a little bit for people who don't know what that is? Can you
go into MyLab? It was a phrase termed a while back, and the idea is that you've got these secret human groups that are abducting people all around the world. I mean, I don't quite get how the logistics would work to start with. And they're the ones that are behind all these abductions. There's no alien abductions. It's the Stephen Greer angle, if you like. All aliens are good. Anything negative is being done by humans. That includes abductions. So you get cases where people report being taken on board a craft. And I saw 10 men in army uniform. Therefore, I'm saying it's not aliens that have taken me on board. It's humans with secret technology. But as we know, countless examples, these aliens can implant images in people's minds. It could be your dead grandmother. It could be men in military uniform. It could be the lady with Chris Bledsoe, etc., etc. So for me, looking at the data with my discernment, I don't buy the MyLab thing. I think it's aliens.
And it's possible too that they could be picking up abductees also. It could, I mean, they're not mutually exclusive. So an abductee could be taken by aliens and then brought back, and then the military could come in and take them to go figure out what happened to this person. What did they do?
There could be some element of research, but I don't think there's a program of abducting people all around the world and performing experiments. If there are, then there would have been maybe some alien interaction initially. With what your scenario, that there might be a follow-up abduction of those people. But again, you don't know what shenanigans these aliens get up to confuse matters. You know, they want to keep people confused. They don't want things to be black and white. They want people to be vague. They don't like people like me, I suppose.
And I think that's why it's so important to have this conversation and to ask these questions as off the wall as I know all of this stuff sounds to someone who's new to this topic. And I routinely struggle daily with a lot of this stuff because I'm just, it sounds like science fiction, but yet we have so much evidence to support that there is a there. And so you have
Grush
to
coming out has given me more confidence to talk like I talk, and maybe fueling for others as well. Because he's hinting at deals with aliens. He's talking about people being killed by the aliens. He's talking about gifted craft. He's talking about all those core things that's to the layman sound nuts. But the more people that come out, the more whistleblowers come out, the more thing it will be considered normal. Rather than being outlandish at the moment.
Was that part of your reason for stepping away from the subject for so long, was that you just felt like you couldn't be taken seriously because there was just so much pushback, or what was, or were you just not finding, the answers?
I couldn't find the answers. There was no Allies of Humanity for me at that stage. That's the one source for me that's answered a lot of questions. And it's given me the confidence to talk about those subtopics within ufology in the way that I do. I wouldn't have had this confidence years ago because I didn't have those answers from the Allies of Humanity. It's all laid out for me in plain English. So that's been my sort of cornerstone, if you like, my Rosetta Stone for giving me the answers that I was looking for, and it gives my site a structure and allows me to talk about it.
What would you say I think it's a fair observation that there's a culty kind of a feel. There's a culty vibe because you have one charismatic person who is talking a lot, and it's just them, and it's like, I have the answer. And I think a lot of people reflexively resist that because we've just seen, I think back to, again, the 90s, the Hale Bop comment, and there's just throughout history we've had so many people like this. What do you say to those folks? And
I would say give it a read. It's all free. What you find with a lot of the charlatans is there's a financial side to it. So a red flag for me would have been if it was a chargeable set of data. But the fact it's all free online, so that's a positive to begin with. And again, it doesn't. The information imparted by the allies doesn't go into sort of frivolous stuff like what they look like or what they eat or what they wear. It's just purely about the beings that are on Earth. That there isn't this sort of narrative of talking a lot about themselves or how great Marshall is, etc. It's really very nitty gritty, just focused on what's going on planet Earth. You don't know what star system the allies are from. You don't know how tall they are, how much they weigh. None of that sort of taxonomy stuff. It's purely telling you about what's going on Earth because we don't have the ability to discern friend from foe. If you look at the world of channeling, it's a confusing soup. One channel will say an asteroid's going to hit Earth next year. Another channel will say there's going to be a polar shift. Another channel will say nothing's going to happen. They can't all be correct. They're all conflicting with each other. So if you look at once you start nuts and bolts and then progress to channeling, which is a natural journey, it just becomes even more confusing. And that's how it was for me, probably for a lot of other people as well. So I would just say to people, give it a read. It's all free. And then look at the data. When you read a statement, is there any evidence for that in the field? If they're talking about people disappearing in strange circumstances and never being returned, are there any examples of that? Look for examples in what they're saying. And
which brings us to your website, Bad-Aliens.info, which I'm curious, how are you able to gather together so much of this compelling evidence that is like impossible to find anywhere else? Like it seems like a lot of this stuff gets scrubbed and is just removed.
Yeah, I think when you're interested in something, you'll have a natural energy to find it, and sometimes things come to you quickly. And to be honest, the core of my website came together in about 5 days. I just had this thoughts in my head of how to structure it, and one becomes adept with Google over time, and you used to start searching for certain cases. I had certain cases in my head that I remember: the Guarapanga mutilation in Brazil from the late 80s, Terry Love case. I thought was a good example for the abduction side. Some of the better David Paulides cases, I had them in my head. So to be honest, a lot of it came together very quickly, and then I've sort of tweaked it as I've gone along. So I mentioned the face peelers earlier in Peru, so I did that recently. So I'm trying to keep it up to date. I have to say though, one thing I've observed with the website, the human mutilation part is by far the most popular visited. That accounts for the vast majority of the visitors that I get. I suppose partly because no one else has sort of put it all under one page before, all the cases that are out there. And I try to keep it no BS, keep black and white. Here's the dates and the people, the location. Sort of make your mind up. And I'm not leaving it open ended. I'm putting what I think is going on in the conclusion, and people can then make up their own minds. I'm not trying to sell anything. It's just purely my own interest, my own journey, if you like.
Sure. Yeah, and I think the thrust of it is very common sense and based in a very real way of responding to a threat. It seems like let's look at what's actually happening. Let's look at the evidence we have is that people are being taken. Some people are being carved up in horrifying ways, and the best we can tell is that these things are related. And my take on Marshall's work is it's very much like a down to earth, like whoa, hold up, let's just take a minute. Let's just take a second before we open the door and let these things come in and take over everything, and we just hand the keys over to our civilization. Let's just stop and let's look at what we know. And what we know is scary as hell. And we should really think about that before we do anything.
And what you notice with Marshall is when he talks about aliens, he doesn't get bogged down in taxonomy and what they look like and how tall they are. It's purely looking at it from a higher level in terms of what overall, what's going on, what's their agenda, why are they coming here. It doesn't sort of go down the Linda Moulton Howe avenue, if you like, of getting bogged down into taxonomy specific. The blondes are from Sirius and the greys are from this one. None of that. Just telling you what's going on, the core things you need to know.
I think that's where I have a hard time with some of Linda's stuff, is that it's so specific.
Yeah.
And it's just like, well, I don't know how you could know all. I don't know how we could have this kind of information. But the David Grush stuff was straightforward and basic enough that he laid out enough to sink your teeth into, that there is a there. And it seemed like that whole thing. Do you get the sense that this whole moment that we're in right now is very choreographed?
I think you can only keep a secret in for so long, and eventually cracks are going to appear. So at some point, a Grush was going to appear. I think that's just the way, the dynamics of society and keeping secrets. Eventually, someone's going to have enough balls to come forward. So it was only a matter of time. So I'm sure there's factions within the military that have a strong, sincere, altruistic. They can see the idea that if we're told about aliens, it will be a big reboot for us in a positive way, and we'll start looking at each other as one without sounding cliched, rather than looking at separate tribes and separate countries. So I think some far-sighted people in the intelligence community can possibly see this as a positive reboot for humanity, and also the fact we've been lied to for so long, and that's immoral and it should never happen in the first place. But yeah, I think there's factions, some that want it out and some don't. I think there might be a strong religious element as well that see them as demons, God versus Satan sort of thing going on. Whereas what we're really dealing with is just physical beings that want the planet's resources. That's the easiest way to look at it.
Yeah. And I think sometimes the easiest way to look at it, the simplest way, is probably the closest to what's actually going on. And I remember an interview with Colonel Phil Corso, where he said his mindset at the end of his life was, we happily sent 18-year-olds into machine gun fire on D-Day, and we told them, this is a war worth fighting, so go for it. And then we turn around and say, well, we can't tell people about aliens because they can't handle it. And it's like, well, they can handle it. We need to shoot straight and just tell people. And I think go ahead.
I was going to similar on that magnitude. I don't think it's for other people to decide what we should know or shouldn't know. Something as massive and as universal as alien life evidence, that's no one should hold the key to that. Everyone should be fully aware, in my opinion. And the longer you keep it a secret, the more things fester, the more confusion there is, the more channelers you get. If all this was nipped in the bud in 47, it may not be this slew of new age bullshit that we've had for 40 years, the new age alien market that's sort of mushroomed. But you have to deal with things as they are now.
Yeah, you have to figure that in that vacuum of information, that's where the disinformation was injected. There was a real desire for data and for information, and I think it was very easy for the military industrial complex to put false stories out there to just fill that gap and send people spinning off into space, so to speak. And we have 40 years, 50 years of that, and then you just don't know which direction's up anymore. It's very hard to get your bearings.
I think as well now with the internet, it's harder for the intelligence community to sort of keep a lid on things. I mean, it does allow them to spread false information, but opposite to that as well, it does allow researchers or people that have got stuff leaked out to get it to a lot of people within a short amount of time. So I think it might be getting increasingly harder now for the intelligence community to keep a lid on things than say it was in the 1950s.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. And as people start to connect the dots and more, eventually this consensus starts to emerge. And then you get a guy like Grush who comes out and says, hey, these are the things I can tell you. And that basically kind of locks in with some of the stuff we've been hearing. So we can sort of start to scrape away some of the rough bits and reveal a little bit more of what's happening underneath. And he talked about, you know, like you said, the craft that were left with the doors open, the lights on, and no one inside.
Yeah.
People being injured or killed with these things. And then, you know, there's just story after story that going back 30, 40 years that we're saying the same thing, but you just didn't know if it was true or not. Now I think it's pretty clear.
Grush almost addressed all the main bullet points, as you say, all those main things that people have talked about for decades. It all came out in like 1 hour, you know, and his interview with Coulthard was amazing. And also the congressional hearing was an historic day as well. So yeah, it gave me a lot of positive thought. The problem now is for any report from NASA, etc., going forwards, everyone's going to compare what's in there to Grush. And you might have this sort of ambivalent, oh, we don't know what it is, we need more data, we need more money. And you've got Grush out on a limb saying this, you know what I mean? So you got this sort of like two parallel worlds going on now.
Yeah.
It's going to be, Grush has been a big ball ache, I think, for a lot of these other guys who started Arrow and the NASA thing. You know.
Have you read Chuck Schumer's amendment to the NDAA, the disclosure amendment?
I've heard of it, but I haven't read it. To be honest, I find a lot of the terminology quite hard to get my head around, to be honest. A lot of acronyms and so forth. But you can go ahead and say what you want to say about it.
Well, I mention it because I'm working on a video on it, and I've been reading it, and it's 64 pages long, and the word disclosure is mentioned over 70 times. The name of the bill is the Unidentified Anomalous Phenomena Disclosure Act.
Yeah,
that's the name of the thing. And in here, this thing has teeth. They basically lay out a framework to peel the onion and go in and even using eminent domain to basically go into these bases and say, we're taking over. We're going to walk in here. And they established a disclosure panel made up of scientists. There's, I think it was 12 people. One of them is an economist. One of them is a sociologist, all picked by the president and various members of the military and security apparatus. And they can nominate these folks, and they lay out a very clear timeline for how fast all this stuff has to happen. And basically, this bill puts together the disclosure team, like the A-team, and sends them out and gives them full power of the law to walk into any facility, public or private, make any claim they need to go into any room and put their hands out and touch any craft that we may have, and then work with the National Archives to collate all this information together, and then in a very quick period of time, make determinations on what the public can know, and anything that is not that they want to keep classified, they have to basically provide a justification and a summary of what basically it is, why it's classified, their justification for keeping it classified, and then they put in place a timeline to review all that stuff. Something like every year or every 2 years, and look at it again and see if it can be declassified. And it puts the onus on the military industrial complex to basically justify their reasons for keeping all this stuff secret. It's an amazing bill. It's a thick read and it's a lot to chew, but everybody should look at this, because the NDAA almost always passes, and if this thing goes through, I mean, that's your roadmap to disclosure.
Well, that's exciting news. Then I hope that happens. I as a British citizen, I do get a bit easily mixed up with these acronyms and all these different groups. You know, looking at the UFO subject within the House and the Senate and so forth, and the Armed Service Committee, this committee, that committee. It's I find it a bit overwhelming at times trying to work out what the pecking order is and who's got access to what. But I suppose the more people that are looking at it, the more chance there is of extracting all the relevant information over time.
It was just amazing to me that you have the Senate Majority Leader introducing a 64-page amendment to a defense spending bill that is almost surely going to pass, and then every page of this thing has the word disclosure on it, sometimes more than once, and it's just like I can see no other way for this to go. So it seems like to go back to the Grush interview, when I watched that first interview, the whole next like 48 hours, I just like I didn't know what to do with myself. I was just like,
yeah,
is this real life? I thought this is.
I think one of the takeaways for me though was you can see how the press is putting itself in certain positions, like the Washington Post. Was it the New York Post? Some of your major press had sort of like keeping out of it or being very skeptical.
New York Times,
New York Times. Some of the other ones are a bit more open to it. So that was a bit of an opener for me as a sort of a British guy, seeing that the press are almost as culpable as the intelligence community. It makes you wonder: is there some guy wielding a stick at higher level saying, "No, you're not going to print that"?
I think that's what it is. I actually
that would
think
help disclosure, isn't it? Part of the problem is the press isn't, the data's there. Grush has said his stuff, but the press isn't put on the front page.
Well, I operate under the blanket assumption that the press is the public relations arm of the Central Intelligence Agency in this country, at least. Like I basically look at the news as our domestic propaganda arm. And I think, that we know through Operation Mockingbird, and there's been historical evidence of this. The CIA has a direct line into every newsroom in America, and if they need to push a story or kill a story, they do. And Grush talked about that. So I don't think there's any question that happens. And I think what you're seeing is, this is just purely speculation on my part, but as you pointed out, Richard Dolan talks about a factional. There's a faction that wants disclosure, and there's a faction that's resisting disclosure. And the faction that wants disclosure has a phone line or a line into some newsrooms, but not all of them.
Okay.
And so some of the stuff, like that's why you see News Nation. News Nation wasn't a big, like it wasn't like a big news.
I never heard of them.
Right. But it looks very real and legit and professional, almost like what the CIA would do if you wanted to put together a quick, flashy news production that looked legitimate. It has all the hallmarks of a legitimate news service, but no one had heard about it until David Grush rolled in. And suddenly it's like, this is the source where all of this, and The Hill, there's like two or three outlets that just keep putting this stuff out. And everybody else is so silent, it's deafening.
It's weird because it's as if, well, it is the case that your journalists aren't serving the public correctly, that there's a bias.
It's just Ross Coulthard out there.
Yeah. Yes, an Australian guy talking on your behalf. Yeah, it's quite surreal, really.
And George Knapp.
Yeah, George Knapp, yeah.
I think that's the inertia of this media campaign that's been pushing for so long, and now we're just seeing a piece of it break off. So you're seeing this little faction, kind of like the Rebel Alliance, like break off, and they've got 2 or 3 little news outlets that they can send stuff to that will push it out there, and that's what they're doing, and they're trying to build the case while the legislation gets pushed through that is really going to make things happen. And I think that's why Grush's function, this is just again my guess, was to light the fuse. But it's really the next 30 or 40 whistleblowers that are coming in behind him.
Yeah.
And Daniel Sheehan is part of the Elizondo, Chris Mellon crew, and he's one of the best attorneys in the world, an expert in constitutional law. And this is one of those guys who clearly has his finger in the pie, and somehow is affecting what's going on here. So I don't think all this legislation just like came out of thin air. Congress, if you know anything about America's government, it's famous for doing nothing except defense spending and taking care of the 1%. That's really what we do. But in terms of actual legislation that helps regular everyday people, it's like a deadlock all the time, and nothing ever moves forward, and it's just kind of a joke. And then suddenly you have these members of Congress on both sides of the political spectrum joining forces, and you have Marco Rubio and Gillibrand and all these folks working together, and it just like happened. It was very fast, and I don't see any other way that this could be going this quickly unless there was an organized push behind it.
I think
You know.
on a microcosm level, it's shown you how the phenomenal will affect people worldwide. So you've got people on both sides of the political spectrum getting together about this, and as we mentioned earlier about uniting humanity, seeing each other as one. Maybe we're seeing on a smaller scale what will occur on a larger scale once disclosure occurs, and people will forget their differences and realize we all sit under the same stars.
I think it makes me, I get the sense that this is a cover your ass moment for a lot of these folks. And I think that whatever, John Ramirez is that one of those CIA guys who comes out and he says, 2027, supposedly they're showing up, and it's going to, Ross Coulthart, he's on record saying that there is a push to do this in a very quick fashion. There's a time factor at work that they have to do this. And I'll see if I could find the quote. Maybe I could drop that in here. But yeah, it seems like the pieces are moving, and there's more than meets the eye. But where there's smoke, there's fire. So there's something going on for sure.
I'm sort of wary of dates because having been in the game a long time, I remember, something that's going to happen in '99 and something was happening in 2011, the 11th of the 11th. It's been a lot of dates over this. It's a bit cry wolf for me, but the sooner the better, really.
Where for the person who's new and is digging into this and wants to learn more about what's going on, obviously your website is a treasure trove and it's a deep dive. So talk a little bit about how you've laid out your website. I really like how straightforward and to the point it is.
So I started off, the first thing actually that I did was I got to come up with a catchy title. So Bad Aliens came into my head, and I wanted Bad-Aliens.com, but that was taken. So I ended up with Bad-Aliens.info. And then once I'd got the title sorted, in my head, I wanted to break the subject down into the phenomena that I thought was associated with the subject. Abductions, with lots of cases, animal mutilations. I was careful there to use the term animal, not cattle, because a lot of people say cattle, but it's not just cattle. There's all sorts of animals. I got some photos of seals that were found around the coast of the UK, all decapitated. I think it was on the third vertebrae. Quite odd. There were some domestic cats that have been found mutilated, foxes, deer, etc., etc. There's one case I read about. Tony Dodd, he's a deceased UK researcher. He recounts the tale of a guy driving along a road in the UK, and a cow fell out of the sky in front of him on the road. I haven't heard of that happening before, but yeah, it was little nuggets from the past.
Yeah.
So animal mutilations, not cat mutilations, because it's animals. Then human mutilations, like I said earlier, that's the most popular part of the site. That's the elephant in the room. That's the one you don't tend to hear many researchers talk about. There's not an awful lot of cases in the public domain. I expect there are probably a lot of cases that the intelligence communities around the world have got on their files. What we find is with South America, they seem to be a little bit more open in reporting a lot of these cases. And like we said earlier, with the internet, cases can get their way into the public domain before the services have a chance of covering it up. And then I've got a section on missing people, where people have found people go disappear. Sometimes they don't reappear. Sometimes they're found dead in an area that was previously searched. And I've got a section called UFO attacks, where there have been attacks by UFOs on aircraft and people on the ground. And I've got a section on alien bases, which looks at remote viewing as the tool for locating where these bases may be. And I also talk at the end about the interviews that Ted Rice has done, who was a lifelong abductee, who features in Carla Turner's final book, Masquerade of Angels. And he's on an excellent podcast interviewed by an Irish guy called Stuart, called Alien Talk. And I think it's the only platform that Ted's currently talking on. And he goes into quite a deep dive of what's going on in some of these alien bases, and some of it's quite graphic, and also about his own experiences as well as being an abductee.
Beyond what's on your website, are there other researchers that you would suggest people look at?
Yeah, I mean, I've got a YouTube channel called Hurley Bird Productions where I've collected a lot of videos done by different researchers. I mentioned earlier I've got 9 Carla Turner videos that are rich in information. I've got some David Jacobs stuff on there and various other people. I like the work of Richard Dolan. I think he's an intelligent researcher, very cerebral. I think his podcast is worth checking out. There are a few other podcasts that have got a massive library of historical documentaries. UFOB, I think they're a valuable resource for historical documentaries.
They're great, actually.
And
yeah.
also one called Eyes on Cinema. They make all theirs are black and white, but they go, they've got old episodes of Sightings from the 90s and interviews with contactees from the 1950s. Again, a big volume of library of historical information at your fingertips. So, those would be ones I think would be. The problem is there's so much data you can get overwhelmed by it all. In a way, we're sort of blessed in the fact there was less information years ago, and it's kind of been incremental for us. But for someone new coming into it, there are so many like YouTube channels, let alone books, that you need to sort the wheat from the chaff. But I think Richard Dolan's a good place to start for people. I think he's got a very measured opinion on the subject.
I like Richard. His approach seems to be that of a weary detective who's heard it all and seen it all, and he takes everything, like you said, very measured approach.
Yeah,
he's like anybody can tell you a good story. Yeah.
He kind of predicted TTSA would ultimately fail. He sort of said at the time it wouldn't last long, and he was correct. Whereas a lot of other people they're going to build a spacecraft and da. But I think Dolan read that situation well.
What are you up to next? Is there anything else that you want to let people know about?
I'm doing another interview in a few weeks. I think it's called the Podcast Basement Underground. I sound awful now because I can't remember the actual title, but I've got another interview coming up. Apart from that, nothing in the UFO front really, no. I try and keep my site up to date, so if I see any information on Twitter and social media, I add it to my site if I think it's relevant. So that's it really. I try to keep a balance because obviously it's quite a deep angle that I've got on the subject, so I try and have a life as well outside the subject. I think it's good to have a balance. Try not to get too obsessed with it.
It can take over your life pretty fast.